Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Sue. I'm so delighted to be here tonight with Professor Dame Sue Black to discuss her new book, Written in Bone, which has just been published by Doubleday. This event comes to you courtesy Penguin Live and the HowTo Academy. One of the country's most eminent scientists, Sue Black is a forensic anthropologist and the current president of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. Born in Stonehaven, for many years she was professor of anatomy and forensic anthropology at the University of Dundee. Both the Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification and the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science were created during her tenure there. She is now the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Engagement at Lancaster University. I first became aware of her work in 2015 when I attended the Wellcome Collection's remarkable exhibition on the science of forensics. There was a film of Sue discussing the work she had done in Kosovo, identifying the bodies of men who had been massacred by Serbian troops. I was struck by her extraordinary combination of empathy and forthrightness and longed to know more about her. I was able to do that when her first book, All That Remains, was published in 2018. That book was a finely balanced mix of the personal and the professional, revealing moving glimpses of the life and personality of its author and containing important revelations about her work. With her new book, she brings us even closer to what's involved in that work, disarticulating the human skeleton and taking the reader through what it can teach us, bone by bone. Much of her work might seem to the casual observer unremittingly grim, but as she has written, she believes and succeeds in showing that our humanity transcends the worst malevolence of which our species and nature are capable. I'm really excited to speak with you, Sue, tonight. Thank you so much for taking part in this event.
It's a pleasure, and thank you very much indeed for that introduction. My goodness me, I can't live up to that, but thank you.
I reckon you can. I want to start for our listeners. They may not, some of you will have bought, I'm speaking to everyone, some of you will have bought Sue's book and it's winging its way to you as we speak. But if you haven't read her first book and haven't read this book, I think we should begin a little bit at the beginning. And so I will ask you to explain what a forensic anthropologist is, Sue.
So the normal question that I get is, what's the difference between an anthropologist and a pathologist? Because most people seem to know what a forensic pathologist does. And the distinction between the two is really important. The forensic anthropologist in the UK is generally not medically qualified. And so therefore we are not allowed to legally have an opinion on the manner or the cause of somebody's death. So we can't sign a death certificate. And so our principal role is about identification, whereas the pathologist is there to say, how did the person die? What was the cause of death? Our job is to say, who was this person when they were alive? And sometimes the bodies that we will work with are intact and it's been perhaps a recent event. They might be disrupted because it's been a train crash or a plane crash. They might be burnt because they've been in a fire, or they might be bodies that are decomposing or are down to skeleton. So when establishing who the person was when they were alive becomes tricky, that's when we become involved. So the sort of static thing is, it's the identification of the human, or what remains of the human, for medical legal purposes.
Very good, very succinct and useful. And I suppose I would like you, without going all the way back into All That Remains, but maybe just tell us a little bit about how you came to do this extraordinary work.
Oh, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time and have never made a conscious decision to be involved in this ever. It makes me the worst possible career subject for schools, because I've never chosen to do this, and I've only ever been faced with decisions, and I've gone, no, that's an interesting thing to do. So there was no drive in me to do this as a profession, because when I was young it didn't exist as a profession. But my maiden name was Gunn, and my father was a tremendous shot, And I used to go out shooting with my father. I would do anything to be with my father. And he would shoot rabbits and deer and pigeons and things. It was always for the pot. And I was always with him. So from a very early age, 7 or 8, I was not in the least little bit fazed by dead animals. And when he'd take them home, my mother was a bit squeamish. And so I got left to skin them and gut them and grill them or whatever was needed. And when I was about 12, my father said to me, "What are you going to do for a job?" And I thought he meant when I grew up, and he meant when I was 12.
Right
Because
now.
good Scottish Presbyterianism, you need a work ethic. And so it seemed very logical that my Saturday jobs, the entirety of the way through my second part of school, was in a butcher shop. So I went from skinning and gutting rabbits to a butcher shop. And then when I went to university, I knew I wanted to do something in biology, but I then got the opportunity to go into anatomy. And anatomy, the dissecting room, was fundamentally almost another butcher shop, but a different animal. And you had a body that somebody had bequeathed when they were alive, those remains, so that you could learn. And you dissected the anatomy from the top of the head to the bottom of the toe. And I was lost. I was completely lost. I was in love with the subject, and I knew that was where I belonged. And it was when I was doing my PhD that I was asked to accompany my supervisor to my first case. So for me, it was about, can I deal with dead animals? Yes. Can I deal with dissecting dead humans? Yes. Can I deal with dissecting dead humans who are recent? And the answer to that was yes. And so in many ways, I didn't choose to get there, but I got through there by almost a process of almost, I don't know, acclimatization in some ways. And so I had a long apprenticeship before I actually got into the job.
One thing leading to
Yeah,
another.
very nicely without a conscious decision in many ways.
In this book, this wonderful book, which I have to say, Sue has said she doesn't have one, so I'm going to hold it up.
Very kind.
So you can admire the wonderful written in bone. And you have focused on the skeleton, which there's a wonderful phrase at the outset of the book. You say that our bones are the last sentinels of our mortal life. Tell us a little bit about why you chose to focus on the skeleton in this way. And I suppose I want to say what it means to you.
So my research has always been in relation to the skeleton. And those people who work in osteology, they get a love for the subject. So I need to have bones, I need to feel bones, I need to touch bones, because it just gets inside you. It's a passion. Bone does that to you, and I don't know why. And you ask any anatomist or any osteologist, they will say exactly the same thing. So from my 4th year in university, being able to research on human bone, I just found that to be the most fascinating thing. And you would think you could learn everything you need to know in 10 minutes or in a year, but you can't. And it just keeps teaching you something new every single time. And when you look at human remains, in some cases, it's a very, very short space of time from the point at which you die to the point at which you become a skeleton. So when I was working in Sierra Leone, for example, you go from a body to a skeleton inside a week. If the body's left outside through animal activity, through insect activity. And so all of that soft tissue, all of those things that we see and think of as being the person, just dissolve and melt away into the ground. And the ground picks those up, and you return to the ground very, very quickly from your soft tissue. But your hard tissue resists it. It resists melting away into the ground. It says, I've got some structure here. It's going to take me a lot longer to disappear. And of course, we have bones from dinosaurs that are thousands and millions of years old. They persist for a very long time. And for me, that makes them a really interesting set of records, because it says when anything happens to you in your life, there is a chance that may be recorded in your skeleton. Whether it's a disease, whether it's an accident, whether it's the way you walk, the way you write, all of these things may get written as a little signature into your skeleton. And for us, it's about using the magnifying glass, excuse me, to be able to find those answers. So it's a big mystery, and it's a big sort of TV detective story every time you have a bit of bone.
And there's one point in your book, and in a sense, I suppose it's kind of obvious, but it was really extraordinary for me, where you kind of invite the reader to think about their own skeleton and how we might be identified by our skeletons. And I found myself thinking, oh yes, I hadn't thought about the fact that I broke my ankle when I was 11, and there was a worry that it had gone into the epiphysis, into the growth plate, and my leg might be too short, and I have these 2 broken fingers, and this internal portrait of myself.
Yeah. But you know it. The fact is, you know that those things are there, but you can't see them. But I'll see them. Well, hopefully I won't, but you know what I mean. If unfortunate circumstances should arise.
If our relationship goes really wrong.
Well, yes. Well, if it goes really wrong, I'll they'll never find the body. But that's another story. It's the fact that somebody else can read that history of what's happened to you. You know it, but somebody else can read it. And I find that fascinating. Now, there's lots of things that will have happened to your body that will never have been written into your skeleton. And that's a bit of your story that we would never be able to find. But just being able to list, it's amazing the number of things when you start to list going through your body. Yes, my neck hurts, so that's probably old age, and that's a bit of arthritis, and yet my knee's a bit tricky. And all of these sorts of things really start to build out and flesh out, in many ways, a picture of who you were when you were alive.
And even perhaps one of the things that struck me early on in the book is who even your parents were. Tell us a bit about, if I'm saying this correctly, the otic capsule.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Like a pro. So when you're an embryo and mum barely knows that you're there, there's a little piece of your head region that forms, that's going to be around, and it's going to form around the bit that's going to become the inner part of your ear. And it's called the otic capsule. And it starts right up in the sort of brain level, and it migrates down, as you'd expect, towards your ear area. And it's right inside your skull, right at the base of your skull. And it's where your semicircular canals are. And those are the things that tell you whether you're lying down or sitting up, and the things that make you go seasick when you're on a boat. It's about where your position and your balance is. And in there, as well as your cochlea, which is the part where the real hearing information is transferred to the brain. So these are really important parts of your inner ear. And they're so important that we don't want them to keep growing. And so we encapsulate them in something that's called the otic capsule. And the bone that forms around this otic capsule, once it's formed, it never changes. So it doesn't remodel. Like almost all other parts of your body, the bone remodels itself. That bit of the otic capsule doesn't. And every part of your skeleton is made up from the things you eat. That's the only way your body can get the building blocks to make your bones, your muscle, your skin. And the building blocks that made that otic capsule aren't made by what you eat. They were made by what your mother was eating while she was pregnant and you were forming. Because once it's formed, it never remodels. And so if we go to the otic capsule, we can identify from the stable isotopes that are there, that's what level of nitrogen or oxygen or any of the other elements, the likely place where your mother was living. Because geographically, we have signatures. We think we've got a terribly cosmopolitan diet, and we really don't. We've actually got a fairly local diet, and mainly to do with the water. Then we'll pick up the signatures that will say, the otic capsule is saying this person is, Northern Scandinavia. This person is classic UK. This is somebody who's from the Northern States in America. That's not telling you anything about the nationality of the mother, but it's telling you where she was when she was eating her lunch, that took in those little bits of nutrients that helped you as a baby to form your otic capsule.
Tremendous.
It's great fun. It just blows your mind. It's the very fact that your mother, what your mother was doing sits inside your head for the rest of your life. Your mother is inside your head for the entirety of your life.
If we needed more evidence of that.
Absolutely.
some of your work involves looking into recent deaths, but you also investigate deaths that may have happened centuries ago. And one of the most striking in this book is your investigation into the remains in Wardlaw Mausoleum, which are supposedly of Simon Fraser, who was the notorious, our Scots listeners I know will especially know, audience, the chief of the clan Lovat, who was a Jacobite and who was eventually, I think, beheaded after the Battle of Culloden. But you had a look into who was actually in this grave. Tell us a bit about that.
So he was a wily old fox, and he was known as the Old Fox. And if anybody is into the television series Outlander, it's the Fraser family that's in the sort of Outlander series. And apparently the Old Fox appears in 1 or 2 episodes as well. He was one of those Jacobites who he decided to have a watch at which way the wars were going, and he swapped sides many times. And unfortunately for him, when the Jacobite rebellion was over in the 1740s, then he was on the wrong side. And so he was eventually captured and he was tried for treason. He was condemned then to hang. I think it was hang, drawn and quartered. And then it was commuted to he would be beheaded, because that was considered to be a better way of dying, if there was to be a better way of dying. So he was due to be beheaded. And there was a question posed by the clan that said, can we please have his body back? Because we want to lay his body in the clan mausoleum in Wardlaw, which is just outside Inverness. And he was the last person to be beheaded on UK soil for treason. And his head was placed on a spike outside the Tower in London, because, you know, we needed to make sure that there was enough of a deterrent against these rebels. And the government initially said yes, they could have the body, and then they said no, you can't, and then they changed their mind again, and so there was a series of changing of minds. And we know that the Clan Fraser went south to London with a coffin, with the intention of taking the Old Fox's body back up to Wardlaw. Now, in Wardlaw Mausoleum, it's a beautifully simple space, and there's a set of stone steps down at the end that take you into an arched vault. And in that arched vault, there are several lead coffins. And there's a very big lead coffin in the corner, which has been breached. So somebody's gone in and had a look. There's no nameplate on it, but there is a separate nameplate at the side as if it's fallen off. And it says that it's the Old Fox. So there's half the clan who believe that the Old Fox, his body was taken back up to Wardlaw and he's in the coffin. And there's the other half who says, no, he was beheaded in London and he's under the Tower of London. And so we had an opportunity, because Wardlaw Mausoleum were looking to raise funds to do some repair work. And of course, with the Outlander series being so incredibly popular, it was a great opportunity for them to reach out to that. And we knew that the coffin had been breached, which meant that actually that whatever was in there was at risk of damage. And so for the sakes of conservation of what was in there, we were given permission to open the coffin. And Dan Snow, the TV presenter, said, right, you know, I'm going to film this, because history, of course, is his thing. He's Mr. History Hit. And he said, because I need to know whether Lord Lovat is in the coffin or he's not in the coffin. And so myself and my colleague Lucina, we set up our trestle tables and all of our scientific equipment that we needed. And she worked in the crypt and I worked upstairs, and we moved the material that we could find from one space up to the other so that we could examine it. And one of the first bones that we took out of the coffin was the sacrum, which is at the base of your spine. And it was a sacrum from a male. It was a sacrum from a robust male, and Lord Lovat was close to 6 foot, which was very tall for the time. He was also rather large, and he was in his 80s, we believe. And so this male sacrum was very robust, and it was from an elderly male. And so Dan Snow at that point went, well, that's it, sold. That's it. We've got Lord Lovat. And we went, oh, you know, one bone does not a full skeleton make. And so he went off and filmed something else. and we carried on taking things out of the coffin. And, you know, there were several bits of bone coming out. And then we found a set of crowns from children's teeth. And we thought, well, that's not supposed to be there. And then we found some sets of bones from a younger person. And then we found another duplicating bone. And we thought, there's more than one person in this coffin. And that's fairly common when you've got a coffin that's been breached, because every time you dig in a graveyard, bones come to the surface. What do you do with them? It's like lifting the carpet to sweep underneath it. You know, there's a coffin there, so we'll put the bones in it. So if there's an open coffin, often you'll find there's more bits of more than one person in there. So we managed to clear out what were at least, I think, 4 or 5 different people. And we got down to the fact that there was a body laid out at the bottom of the coffin, and it didn't have a head. And of course, that was significant because there was a possibility that Lord Lovat had his body returned, but they may have kept his head on the spike. And so we did this as a public engagement event with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And we had 400 people in the room, and we had several hundreds of people, if not thousands, watching online, because Dan Snow streamed it across the world at the time. And the press had said to us, there's no way you'd have put something like this on if it's not him. And so we kept everyone in the room for about 2.5 hours, I have to say, building the tension. It was just superb. And we got to the final stage, and, you know, we took a show of hands in the room and said, you know, hands up if you believe it's the old fox that's in there. And I would say 99% of the people in the room said, yes, it's him. And it wasn't. So it was the body of a young female. And we have no explanation for it. So did the coffin empty go down to London? They weren't given the body, so they brought the coffin back up. It laid in the mausoleum empty. What's the point of having an empty coffin? You may as well put somebody in it. And maybe then they took the coffin plate off because it wasn't him that was in it. And whoever this woman was, and we've no records of who she was, when they breached the coffin, because somebody went in to have a look, did they see a head and think, oh, there shouldn't be a head? Did they remove the skull? Or did they think they actually had a trophy, that they had the skull of Lord Lovat? We don't know. But somebody stole her head.
That's another.
It was fantastic.
There's a novel in there, I would say.
Isn't there? Yeah.
I want to urge members of our audience, do please, if you have any questions for Sue, and nothing is off limit, she says, do type them into the Q&A and I will ask them as we come towards the end of our session. I wonder if you feel differently about working on with bones that are centuries old, as opposed to doing, I guess, what I would call more contemporary work. And I guess it's partly a question, you know, you write very interestingly about the respect that is due to human remains. But I just wonder about this distance of time between a skeleton like the one you were just talking about and someone who's had some accident before them a few weeks ago.
Sure, they are very different, but the sentiment, I don't think, should be different. The sentiment for me is that person was alive, that person was somebody's son, daughter, mother, father, whatever it may have been. And just because there's nobody left to remember or mourn doesn't mean that you have a right to treat that person differently. You do treat them differently in terms of the law, because if a body has been dead more than 75 years before the current time, it is technically archaeological. Now, 75 years ago takes us back to the Second World War. So technically, if you think of it in a legal sense, anything before the Second World War is now archaeological material. Now, you know, my grandparents are in that category, and I certainly would not be happy at the thought that somebody was, for, you know, interest's sake, digging up my grandmother. That's because I know that I'm still alive to remember. But because that family are no longer alive doesn't, I think, give us the right to treat that body any differently. The law, in terms of a forensic investigation, will require us to treat them differently. So, for example, when we were looking in a cemetery for the body of Moira Anderson, little girl who went missing in Coatbridge in the 1950s, we were employed effectively as an archaeological excavation to go down and to see what we could find in the cemetery, because they were old burials. And so we weren't operating in a forensic mode, we were operating in a mode that was recovering bodies, but not identifying them till we got to a level where we suspected, if she was included, that she would be there. And we had made it very clear with the police that if we found any remains that looked like Moira, we would switch instantly from that body recovery to a forensic mode. And what we mean by that is, in a forensic mode, that word forensic means pertaining to the forum, to the courts, because that's where forensic comes from. And so we are there to explain evidence to a courtroom. And all the time when you're in a forensic case, your eyes are not with the investigation, your eyes are in the courtroom. I'm going to have to collect evidence, I'm going to have to analyze evidence, and I'm going to have to present evidence so that the triers of fact, which is the jury, can make a decision on somebody's guilt or innocence. And so it's a very different lens in which you view skeletons in a forensic view than if you're in a body recovery or an archaeological. Because in archaeology, you know you're not going to court. You know that there's not going to be a set of parents or family likely to be grieving, to be upset, to be questioning. So it would be so easy to let archaeological bones become something less important. But I think for humanity's sake, you do that at your own risk, your own peril, because I think all human remains need to be dealt with the same level of respect.
One thing that's very striking in this book is the way you stress the way, and actually the Lord Lovett case exemplifies this too. One thing that's very striking is the way you stress how important it is to keep an open mind and not draw conclusions until it's too soon. You tell the story of a child's bones that were found in a very surprising place after a fire. I wonder if you can sketch out that story briefly, really just to show how you kept your mind focused on the evidence rather than perhaps what you anyone might have expected to find.
Yes, it was a tragic case. It was two young boys who lost their life in a house fire, and when the ceiling collapsed, the boys were buried. The chances are that they died from suffocation, and I was not involved in the investigation. But a few weeks later, the family had gone back to the house, and they'd found a little pile of bones in the garden. And they called the police, and the police looked at it and he went, "Oh, you know, I'm a rural chap, I'm a farming chap, those are cat bones, nothing for you to worry about." And so they went to the mortuary, but the pathologist was on holiday. And so they gave me a call and said, you know, could you look at the bones? Because we think they're cat. And so you go into the mortuary thinking they're probably cat bones, but they clearly weren't. They were human child remains, small fragments of human child remains. And I said to the police, you know, I'm sorry, but these are from a child, and they're from a child of between 4 and 6, which I didn't know was the age of one of the children that had been involved in the fire. And they didn't want to hear. They didn't want to know, because this was not what they wanted to hear. And so I came away from the case and had no further involvement until, totally by chance, a local lawyer in my hometown got in touch with me and said, look, I'm representing the family. Apparently they found some bones. Would you have a look at them? And I said, well, I've already had a look at them. And they didn't know. And so I was able to identify which parts of the body it was. There was then an investigation into that police force as to how this had happened. And nobody had ever asked me for my opinion as to how this little pile of bones might have got into the garden. And eventually, when the investigation had drawn to a close and this review was going on, the officer said to me, well, what do you think? And I said, well, I wasn't at the crime scene, I can't tell you, but I can surmise for you what might have happened. And so I laid out a scenario, and it fitted with the evidence, but it doesn't mean it was the truth. And sometimes, you can have that opinion that says, I know it's human, I know it's from the boy, therefore I have to explain, how did they get from inside the house to outside the garden, and how were they missed? And you have to fill in the blanks almost. It's like one of those games where you've got bits of a sentence and words are missing, and your job is trying to put those words in.
Fascinating. You write about, mainly I would say this is to some extent a less personal book than All That Remains, but in discussing something called the Harris lines, which are lines laid down in our bones that measure, that show trauma, you tell the story, very difficult to read, of your own sexual assault when you were quite a young girl.
Yeah.
And I felt very moved to read it. I wonder why you chose to share it in this context and how you think it connects to your work.
It's a really interesting question, because I'd never had any intention. And it was one of those things, and crime writers will tell you, because I'd spent a lot of time with crime writers, they will tell you that sometimes the story writes itself. And I had been talking about the long bone, so in the long bone section, and I was talking about a case where it was not my case, but I just happened to be in the mortuary that day. And it was a young boy, a very young boy, who'd committed suicide. And nobody could understand, because he'd come from a good home, there weren't any problems. And the pathologist had popped the x-ray up on the screen, and I could see these little white lines at the bottoms of the bones. And I just walked past and said, oh, that's really interesting. And he said, well, why is it interesting? And I talked about these Harris lines. And they're lines of increased density that form in bone when there's a trauma. Now, that trauma might be something like ill health. It could be anything. I can't tell you what causes them, except it is a stress that's placed on the human body. And it's as if the body says, I haven't got the energy to waste growing the bones. I've got to transfer the energy to elsewhere. And your bones just go into this holding pattern. And these Harris lines get left. And it was the young boy, eventually, when they started to question the family, because I had said that these are happening on a very regular basis. Has he got ill health every year, or what is it? And that was the point at which the young boy's father broke down, and for the first time admitted that his father used to sexually abuse him as a child. And they, as parents, went away on holiday every year because they worked in a seasonal environment. And Grandad came to stay. And Grandad was therefore abusing his grandson. And his grandson knew this. This was the trauma every year of knowing that Grandad was coming to stay and visit. And that only came out simply as a sort of throwaway comment. And it just seemed like the logical next thing to say, I wonder if I had a Harris line. I wonder if in that time when I was 9, when I was sexually abused, did I lay down a Harris line? And it was just one of those moments of musing about your own body and the way your own body relates to it. So it wasn't an intention to give away any sort of great secret. It just seemed like the natural thing to flow from that point. And that's why it's there.
I suppose one thing that struck me was that you kept quiet about this when you were a little girl.
Yeah.
When you eventually did tell your mother, you were not believed.
No. My mother wanted life to be, my mother wanted to marry Stuart Granger and live in Hollywood. Do you know what I mean? She wanted life to be roses round the door. She never wanted things in life to be horrid and hard. And for her to hear what her daughter had gone through and not to have known would have been far too much for her to cope with, far too much. So it's much easier for her to say, you're making it up. And that's okay, because I understand why she did that. What I then had difficulty with was that she obviously wrestled with it a little bit. And then she said to me, well, if it did happen, I'll bet it was. And she gave me a name of somebody. And that stuck with me, because the name she gave was a man who had never been anything other than a delight. He was a dreadful flirt. He was funny. He was somebody who, was the life and soul of a party, but had never put a foot wrong. And I was struck by the fact that my mother could so easily blame an innocent person for something rather than ask me who it was. And I wouldn't have told her anyway. And I think and it was Ruth Davidson, when Ruth was writing her book on, she'll kill me now because I can't remember what it was called. I think it was Yes, You Can, Yes, She Can, or something along those lines. And she asked the question. It was the first time that I'd ever talked about it publicly. And I started to think about why I'd never talked about it publicly. And that was because I was past it. In many ways, I'd gone past it. I didn't need to talk about it. It's in there, it's in your head, it never goes away. Once you're a victim of something like that, it does stay with you forever. But it wasn't a defining part of me. But what was defining was the fact that I felt it was wrong. I was outraged for an innocent man to be accused by my mother of something he didn't do. And I think that stuck with me more than anything about it. And I didn't start doing the work on paedophile cases until I was in my 40s. I was a grown woman with 3 children by that point, and sufficiently, I think, experienced in the distance you need to create between your personal life and your professional life, that I didn't feel in any way I had necessarily anything in common with the cases that I was working.
I think to me it was, it's also interesting to think about someone who isn't believed and then spends their life kind of looking for evidence that you can't, argue with.
But I'm a great believer of innocent until proven guilty. And, our drive is to put the right person on the right side of the bars. We don't want an innocent person to be wrongly accused, but we don't want a guilty person to go free either. And our role as a scientist is to be unbiased, it's to be objective, it's to be able to let the court decide. And sometimes we think the courts make the right decision, sometimes we think they don't. There's nothing, we can't do anything about that. And my job is not to find someone innocent or guilty, it's to provide the evidence that allows the jury to do that.
I'll have one more question before I open it up to the questions that are being put forward. I suppose I would like to ask you if you have a favorite bone. Now I'm thinking I don't want to guess, but you tell a story about the second cervical vertebra, C2.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that's a favorite. I like the second cervical vertebra. It gives the most amazing fracture if you hang somebody. So I do like it. It's very unusual. I love a little area of bone at the base of your skull just because it has the most wonderful name. It's called the spheno-occipital synchondrosis, which I just think is lovely. But if I had a favorite bone, it's probably your collarbone. It's probably the clavicle, because it's the bone that first forms when you're feeling
me. That's yeah. I never, if you would ask me to guess which bone, that's so surprising.
So just in the very first months of life, it starts to form as bone, and it grows regularly by about 1 millimeter a month once it gets to a certain age. So for identifying age in fetuses, it's a really useful bone. But it's fully formed. It looks like an adult bone from the moment it's formed, which tells you that in ancestral terms, it hasn't needed to evolve any more than it has. It kind of got there a long time ago. And it's also got a little bit of growth right in the midline here that allows us to tell age right up until into the middle 20s. So as a bone, it helps me determine age from the fetus through to middle 20s. That's quite an achievement for a bone, I think.
Yes, I think that
survives fire terribly well. So of all of the bones that survive, it tends to survive really well.
Good. I like that. I like that. So we have some questions.
Sure.
Here's the first one, which is from Holly, who is studying forensic anthropology at university and about to do her final year of her bachelor's degree. She asks, what would you say has been the most difficult part of your career in this field?
Gosh, the most difficult part for my career. Personally, it's about learning how to keep my mouth shut because I'm not very good at that. I hate the courtroom. So out of anything, I find the courtroom a very distressing place. It's not a good place for a scientist because the rules of the courtroom are held by the lawyers and the judge, and you can only answer the questions you're asked. And if they don't ask you the right question, then you can never give the right answer. And, in an adversarial system, one side of that courtroom wants you to be and will paint you to be the world, and the other side of the courtroom wants to make you out to be a blithering idiot. And one of them will win. And I've been both. I've been the expert and the idiot. And learning how to not take it personally is really hard. So there's a huge excitement in young students studying the subject who think, you know, this is great, and it is. But bear in mind, its sole purpose is to go into the courtroom. And in the courtroom, a very clever lawyer wants to prove you as being an idiot. So you have to know your subject, absolutely have to know it.
Very good. Another question from Marie. What are the hopes for how technology will change how you work, and what problems will it help you solve in the future?
Well, I think if you look at, in my lifetime, we've seen the biggest development in forensic science, and that's the use of DNA. So when Alec Jeffreys in Leicester had that moment when he couldn't get his research project to work, and he couldn't figure out why he couldn't get it to work, and the reason was because everybody's DNA is different. That was just such a shift, such a paradigm shift in forensic science. There are fewer of those, and they don't happen very often, but there are few of them in my field in forensic anthropology. Most of what we do requires experience, and it is about identification of bone. It is about looking at the evidence, analyzing the evidence. It's not about having a machine where you can push a button. But one of the things that we are doing in the work that I do in forensic hand identification, which is mainly for identification of paedophiles, is that we're looking to train computers to be able to take photographs of hands and to be able to abstract the pattern of veins or the pattern of skin creases. And if it can do that, then it allows us through mathematical algorithms to trail through millions of images on a database, which we'd not be able to do just as a one person looking through it. So there's huge leaps coming, I think, in artificial intelligence, and some of it will impact on our work, but probably not as much as in many other fields.
So what you're describing, in a way, that's a kind of filter before
Yes.
the human work comes in.
The court will always require a human to give the opinion, always.
And that, I'll just interject to say that that's a field in which you've been very much a pioneer, I think, that hand identification,
yeah,
as opposed to just, we think of fingerprints being used for identification. But that was fascinating to me to learn about that.
It's a crime that's unusual. Indecent images of children, when you look at child sexual abuse, there are few crimes in which you either photograph or film yourself committing the crime. If you're going to rob a bank, you don't film yourself. You're going to murder someone, you don't film yourself. But often you find that if people intend to abuse a child, they will film it or they will photograph it because they want to relive it, or they want to share it with like-minded people, or they might use it as a commodity to sell it. So it's an asset. And so we have these images that show child sexual abuse, and most of the time, the part of the body of the perpetrator that is in view of the camera is the back of their hand. And so we use the anatomical features from the back of the hand to say, can we identify it? And all of you out there, have a look now if you doubt me. The vein pattern on the back of your right hand will be different to your left. And the pattern of skin creases across your knuckles on every single finger will be different. And they will be different if you're an identical twin. And that's what makes it really exciting.
Gosh, that's amazing. That's amazing. And here's a question from Gillian, who identifies herself as your old Dundee train buddy.
I know who that is.
And she said, what is your biggest bugbear you see on CSI type programs on the television in relation to forensic science?
Well, first of all of the practitioners are gorgeous. So, they're all tall and slim and, beautiful Hollywood smiles and perfect nails and jewelry. So it's not like that. It's really not a sexy subject at all. That irritates me. But what also I think irritates me more than anything is that there's often a real dumbing down of the science. It's this view that if you press the button, you'll get the answer, and you'll always get it within 45 minutes because that's the length of the episode. And so there is, I think, probably in the 1990s and heading into the 2000s, there was a real explosion of these forensic television programs. And they talk about a CSI effect, which is, youngsters in school find forensic science really interesting because it is. But they watch television and think, well, that's what I could do. And universities, around the turn of the millennium, there were a lot of courses put on that had the word forensic in it. And I think at one point I found 460 courses on UCAS that had the word forensic in them. And it was things like forensic investigation and modern dance. And that's the point at which you have to ask, are universities really teaching people anything about forensic investigation? No, they're not. They're using the sexy F word to get students onto their courses. So that irritates me. Thank you, Gillian.
Elle asks, how do you feel about anthropology and anatomy departments in the UK that continue to keep historically collected specimens of Indigenous and First Nations peoples whose communities have requested repatriation? Is it ethically acceptable to refuse to return these remains?
So there has been a huge movement in that area over the last 20 years and more. And I'm of the view that if there is a population, if there is an Indigenous population or any population who feels that they have a responsibility for the remains of their own descendants, or they are the descendants of, I should say, then we have to listen, and we have to listen very carefully. Why do we want to keep them in dusty cupboards where nobody may look at them? There is an opportunity now with permission to take three-dimensional scans of everything, to photograph things, if we're allowed to do it. Hand them back, why not? Because I think the closure that populations and civilizations have, knowing that the people that belong to them are where they need to be in their own heartland, is extremely important. And I don't think in this day and age we have any justification whatsoever for holding on to remains that we can prove belong to that group. But the other side of that is you need to be able to prove they belong to that group, because it would be equally wrong to release remains to a group where that individual never belonged. And so the science is really important to make sure that if the claims are there that this is an Indigenous individual, that indeed they are. And there's no reason in my books for not repatriating those.
Thank you. Here's I think it's going to be yes or no question, maybe or maybe not. Jackie,
I can't do yes or no.
Jackie
I'm
curious about this. Can you tell someone whether someone has had tattoos from their bones?
Not from bones, no. You can. So if what happens is when you have a tattoo, the dye goes in between the two layers of the skin, and it's big macromolecules of dye. That's why the tattoo sits there. But the body still breaks down some of those inks, and they go into the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system drains away all the tissue fluid, and they go to lymph nodes, and these nodes are in places like your armpit, and they act like a sink trap that catches hair in the shower. And so your lymph nodes become multicolored if you've had tattoos. And so you can see it in other soft tissues, but you can't see it in bone.
In bones. You've written, of course, about some of the extraordinary work that you have done in places like Kosovo, which I mentioned, and Sierra Leone. And Gemma asks, how do you decompress after an intense case, especially when it's something traumatic has happened?
It's a really interesting question, and I don't know that I've got a very good answer for it, because I often don't feel I need to decompress. So I'm very conscious that what I do is a job. I go in, I do what I can, and I leave. So I don't take it home with me. I don't dwell on why did a parent do that to a child? Why did this group of individuals line a dozen men up against a wall and shoot them? And the reason I don't do that, I think, is it comes back to a very dear friend of mine, Charlie Hepburn, who was head of CID in Northern Constabulary. And when I was going to start looking at cases, paedophile cases, he'd said to me at the time, don't do it, was his advice. And of course I didn't take that. And he said, what you have to do is you have to divorce yourself from the situation. You didn't cause it. You're not responsible for it. You don't have the guilt for it. You're only going in there to do your job. And I thought that was the most important protective piece of advice he could have given me. So I genuinely don't take it away. But I'm also not so naive as to think that it might not affect me at some point. So my very dear friend Richard Shepherd, who wrote Unnatural Causes last year, and he's a pathologist who's done 22,000 postmortems in his life and never thought for a moment that post-traumatic stress would be something that would affect him. And he talks beautifully about being surprised. Suddenly, it was pieces of ice being dropped into a glass, and it brought him straight back to the Bali bombings, to all the bodies laid out that were bloating and decomposed. And he had a really, really tough time overcoming it. So I'm not so arrogant and naive to think it won't happen, but it hasn't happened. And I've never felt the need to physically de-stress.
Charlotte wants to know, has your job changed your perspective on life?
Yes, I think unquestionably, and the biggest change came with Kosovo, because being in Kosovo and standing next to somebody at a graveside who has lost everything. So her husband's been murdered, her children have been murdered, she's been raped, her belongings have been stolen and burnt, and they have nothing. And they're standing with you at the side of a grave, wanting you to give some consolation and confirmation of what has happened. And they will still offer you whatever they have. It might be a cup of water, it might be a cup of tea. And that humanity that you find even in the worst, darkest places in the world, I think is a real spark for humanity. And that taught me there are some things in life that are important and there are some that just aren't. So I don't care if my car gets scratched. I don't care if the Hoover doesn't go round. But I did care every night that I hugged my children before they went to sleep. And I think it makes you prioritize what's important. And I think that was a very, very valuable lesson for me.
Catherine wants to know, you have advised crime authors such as Val McDermid, who I think is a very good friend of yours.
Dreadful woman, absolutely awful woman. Very, very dear friend.
You have advised her about aspects of forensics and anatomy for her fictional works. Given all your experience and knowledge, are you ever tempted to write fiction?
No. So I can absolutely do that one with a no. I don't think I have the ability to craft a story and tell it, because there's a real skill. Who am I telling, Erica? There's a real skill to writing. It's easy when it's fact, because it is telling stories and you know all the pieces of it. But to construct that story, to keep a pace, to be able to introduce characters, to make it all hold together, I don't think I have that gift. So I'm really happy to advise when they've got queries on a number of things, but I've always said they don't have to worry. I'm not going into competition. I'm not going to be a crime writer.
Do you read crime fiction yourself?
No. So that's always a dreadful thing. So Val McDermid and Stuart McBride and various others, God bless them, who I advise, they always say, and Ian Rankin every time says, what's my favourite book? So what's my favourite book that you've read? And I will say the next one, because I've not read one. And he knows that full well. So I don't read crime fiction now.
Fair enough. Not related to bones, but your work with universities. I believe that due to COVID, they are not taking bodies at the moment. How will medical students work and learn without bodies? Is that true?
Yeah, it is. It's true in Scotland, certainly. I'm not sure what the situation is in England. At Lancaster University, we don't do body dissection, so it's not relevant for me at my current university. But I do know from Dundee University and the Scottish universities that they are not accumulating bodies at the moment for dissection purposes. Quite how that will play out, I don't know. My fear is that universities will view this as an opportunity to stop dissection and, teach anatomy from computers and from books, which some do. I think there's a tremendous loss if we do that, a huge loss of knowledge. So my fingers are firmly crossed that it will go back to where it should be. And one of the things that I'd said when I went to Dundee in 2003 was the only reason I would go to Dundee's anatomy department was if they did full body dissection. And I said, if they ever wanted to get rid of me, then what they had to do was stop dissecting and I'd go. So when I did leave, they were still dissecting, but this is just unexpected. And there was never any intention not to continue at Dundee, but it's just the way it is at the moment.
That's also, I've had conversations with my friend, the neurosurgeon Henry Marsh, who wrote a wonderful book, Do No Harm, and he's now retired from the NHS, but he has a similar, even before COVID, a similar fear that there would, you know, that 3D scanning, and wonderful as it is, he said, doesn't replace.
No, it doesn't, because what you have is one body. So if you do a 3D scan, it's one body that everybody looks at, and what the surgeon misses is the variation. And human anatomy is all about variation. And if we can't teach our surgeons variation, we're in a difficult situation in the operating theatre.
We have an anonymous question. Good one. A lot of people look up to you as a mentor and aim to learn a lot from your values. Who do you look up to?
My greatest, I suppose, my greatest influence growing up and as a child was my grandmother. And she was inordinately important to me. She was one of these people who, irrespective of your age, she dealt with you at the same level. So she could be friends with a 7-year-old and friends with a 15-year-old. And I found her aspects of life and her views on life really compelling. She wasn't a particularly religious person, but she believed very firmly in Christian principles of doing good and not doing harm, of being kind, of being honest. And she epitomized, I think, for me, everything that I wish I could have been. And I wish she could have lived longer, because I had so much more, I think, to learn from her. So even though she's not with me and hasn't been for a very long time, she's remained my standard. But I have lots of people around me who do things that I could never do. And I look up to them enormously for what they're capable of doing. I look at my colleagues in Lancaster, and it's happening in universities around the country, thinking, how do they organise, you know, a 3-dimensional timetable to make sure students are where they should be? My goodness me, isn't that a gift? I can't do it.
Final question. Before we will, alas, have to end this wonderful event. Someone asks, KM, you've done so much in your career, but what do you think is your greatest professional achievement?
I do always take it back to Kosovo. And Kosovo, for me, in one particular case, was about being the right person in the right place at the right time, that point at which all the planets align. And it was a family, and those of you who've read All That Remains will know it. It was a family who all lost their life in a rocket-propelled grenade, apart from father. And there were 8 children. There were 11 people in total. And Dad recovered all the remains he could and buried them. And our job, when we came along several months later, was to uncover these remains and try to identify each of the 11 bodies. And so we laid out 12 white sheets in the mortuary. And it was simple to separate out 3 adults, but we had 8 children between the ages of just a few months and then 14 years of age. And being able to find a little piece of every child and know that it belonged to that child, and to be able to put it on that sheet of plastic in the mortuary was important, because it meant we could hand a body bag back to the father with a name of the child, which is what he wanted more than anything. And at that point in my career, I was halfway through writing the first textbook on identification of children's remains. So I felt I was the right person, right place, right time. If I never ever did anything else in my life, then I would have been satisfied that the purpose was there for that case.
So it's a wonderful story, and I will commend to readers, if you haven't read All That Remains, it's a marvelous book. But of course, I will hold up once again, Written in Bone, which is really just terrific, absolutely fascinating. I am first going to thank, before we close, everyone for coming. And if you have any comments on the event, just get in touch with Penguin Live. We put out this event with Penguin Live and with the HowTo Academy. And I want to thank our bookseller, Primrose Hill. And I also want to mention Penguin Live's next online event, which is Chris and Rosie Ramsey on, I'm going to say it, Shagged, Married, Annoyed, which is on the 10th of September. But before we go, I really want to thank you so much, Sue. It was absolutely fascinating and really wonderful to talk to you. And thank you so much for your generosity.
Oh, thank you, Erica. That's very, very kind of you. It's such a pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.